G'day guys and welcome back to the channel. So about 6 months ago now, I released a video on the problems and issues I'd experienced with my Landcruiser 200 series, but more specifically to do with the accessories and modifications that are added to it. Since then, I've used the vehicle on numerous weekend camping trips and more recently a 3-week trip through the Pilbara. That series, Chasing Adventure, has just been released on the channel, and in the very first episode, you guessed it, we had electrical problems that caused issues throughout the trip. The electrical issues on the cruiser keep continuing and growing. Some of those issues were intermittent, but some caused issues for the full 3 weeks. And since this trip, I've had the vehicle looked at by an auto electrician, and the majority of these faults I've been able to diagnose and repair. So in today's video, we're going to go through all of the faults individually, what caused them, how we repaired them, and I'm also going to break the video down into chapters. So if you're interested in a very specific problem or issue that I had, check out the description below or the timeline where it will be stamped with those issues so you can skip forward to that section. But without further ado, let's get started. One of the issues that I encountered, and probably the easiest to diagnose and later repair, were the side lights mounted to the roof rack of the Landcruiser. In the meantime, because we've got no light, we're using our roof rack side lights. We've been blowing some more fuses and our passenger side isn't working. So I'm going to try and fix that while we can as well. On this most recent trip, along with a couple of instances in the past, I have had some issues with these passenger side light force rock lights blowing fuses. Now I've got a pair on either side and both have their own individual circuits and are individually fused by 7.5 amp fuses in the aftermarket fuse block mounted by Ultimate four-wheel drive equipment. Now this is more than ample, as these pair of lights only draw about 0.9 of an amp together. Now previously I thought maybe it's a one-off issue. I've only blown about 2 fuses in the last 2 years. However, on the Pilbara trip it became very obvious that this wasn't the case and there was something wrong with this passenger side. On one particular night, I blew 3 fuses in quick succession and were unable to use these lights and ended up substituting for a more portable solution to make sure we could light up camp. Later on in the trip, I replaced that fuse again and it started working just fine. So I was quite puzzled by as to why this circuit was intermittently working sometimes and not others. When I got back from the trip, I had time to have a close look at these lights and have a bit more of a dig around in the circuit. And what I did notice is I could visually inspect the lights and see condensation within the units. Water plus electrical components generally don't mix. This is, I think, is exactly what happened on the trip. That night that I blew 3 fuses in quick succession, it had been raining and was raining pretty heavily, and therefore I believe water is getting into this unit and short-circuiting, hence blowing the fuse. This would also corroborate the fact that when I changed the fuse later on in the trip, when things had dried out, it went back to working just fine again. This is very disappointing, given that Light Force generally have a very good name for quality and a backed up reliability for their products. However, these two definitely don't reflect that. Now I have noticed that on the driver's side there is some condensation build-up in those units too. However, I'm yet to have any issues with that particular circuit. So it's something that I haven't got repaired just yet, as I have quoted some replacement for like products with the steadies are going to cost quite a few $100s to replace with those angled brackets and wiring them in. So I'll leave it for later on. However, I definitely won't be buying the Rock 9s again. So you may have also noticed that I have some LED light bars mounted to the roof rack now as well, but I should say they are way too bright and definitely not designed for a camp light. That'll be something I talk about later down the track in a future video, but for the time being, I'm going to ensure that I carry a portable option to replace a potentially faulty circuit. So another issue I faced on that Pilbara trip was the ARB air compressor. And in addition to that, this morning we've had the air compressor circuit go down as well. So it was the first time I needed to use the compressor on the trip. Day 4, we were heading out from Calgan's Pool towards the highway, pulled over to inflate our tyres, flicked that switch and nothing happened. I had no power to that ARB compressor and was unable to inflate my own tyres. Now strangely enough, I could still use the paddle switches here for the airbags in the rear suspension, and that would turn the compressor on, which means that I knew the compressor was still functioning and working. However, it wasn't getting power through the switch and I wasn't able to get air out of this outlet. I further took the switch apart, checked it with a multimeter and confirmed that that circuit was still completing through the switch itself, so I knew it was an issue with the switch. So I also used the multimeter to check the wires and the signals going into the back of that switch, and that's where I found my problem. I was getting no voltage or any sort of signal through those wires, and therefore there's no power going to the compressor to tell it to turn on. Now, without pulling the car apart roadside, which I wasn't going to do, and being a fairly minor issue, I was able to rely on friends for the rest of the trip to help me pump up my tyres each and every time we went off-road. But we've still got no air compressor, so lucky we have some good friends, eh? That's what friends are for. This was another issue that I had checked out by the auto electrician. It turns out there was an issue back up in the panel somewhere. Not exactly sure what caused it or how it came to be, but anyway, some new wiring was laid and we now have a functioning air compressor again. But I also took this opportunity to have the circuit rewired from its power source. So originally, the ARB compressor along with the inverter and the winch were wired up to run off the cranking battery. Because it draws such a high amount of amps, the cranking battery is a better suited battery when you're running traditional ADM setups. However, now that I've got an auxiliary lithium battery, I had this ARB compressor rewired across that lithium auxiliary. Not only is it not going to draw off the cranking battery anymore, but it also means that I can use this ARB compressor now when the vehicle is switched off. Now, probably one of the most frustrating issues on that trip was the loss of power to the Emu Wing box here. We've also lost all power to the Emu Wing system. A bit of a strange issue going on there, I'm going to have to look at it a bit later, but we've got no power to the battery chargers, the inverter, the water tank gauge, or even the water pump. So as mentioned there, I lost power to this box along with a few other devices, and they were all wired up from an Nava 6-port fuse block mounted underneath the box just inside this panel. Now this box here powers my torch chargers, an interior light here, my water tank gauge and my 1000-watt inverter. But probably the most important part of that circuit is this, the water pump. So this was an issue that I mentioned in that last video 6 months ago, and it was a bit of a strange one. But they didn't lose power altogether, they just dropped down to 3 volt. Now I can't understand as to why this would only receive 3 volts, so I took it back to Ultimate Equipment, but as my luck would have it, all the items started working once it got into the workshop, and they've been working ever since with the full 12 volt. Many of you commented stating that the 3 volt issue is probably relating to an earth point. Now, despite checking and rechecking all of the earth points that I could find, I didn't find the problem to this issue. And since making that video, this issue has been happening more frequently and for longer periods of time. And just before I went on that Pilbara trip, about 3 days before actually, the circuit went down again and I knew that I wouldn't be able to rely on it for a 3-week outback trip. For the accessories in the Emu Wing box, I wasn't too concerned. I mean, overall they're just torch chargers and I can gauge roughly how much water I'm using. But the biggest issue, my biggest concern was by far the water pump. This is the primary way for me to access my 55-litre onboard water tank. So what I did is I removed the wires from that Nava fuse block, cut them off, put a 2-pin plug in and created a very temporary wiring loom that went from that 2-pin plug across to a cigarette lighter. And I ran this cable across the back of the vehicle to the passenger side where I do have a cigarette lighter port. Although a little bit cumbersome and a bit frustrating to use when you've got the right equipment, at least I could access that water pump regardless of whether or not that circuit was working. Now, even more frustratingly, halfway through the trip, the power returned to that circuit. The Emu box was back working again. However, because I had cut the Nava fuse block wires to create this little temporary plug, it meant that I still had to keep using my wiring loom for the remainder of the trip. Very frustrating, but hey, at least I had reliable access to water. Now, another issue was the 1000-watt inverter. Now, obviously, this device being quite a heavy-duty and high-powered device wasn't powered off a Nava fuse block, but it had its own wiring through as well, but was suffering from the exact same 3-volt issue. But what I did find is that this inverter was also the cause of the issues, or at least triggered this box to go down. Turning that inverter on would start it for a second, and then all the systems would return to 12 volt. So what I did before the trip is completely disconnect that inverter, and I just gave up on using it for the trip. Well, I am glad to report that yes, the issue was diagnosed and it had been repaired. And for all of you who said it was an earthing point, well, you are correct. It turns out the issue was the Victron battery monitor shunt that controls the battery BMV 712 monitor in the rear of the Landcruiser. This is mounted in the negative side of all of the electrical components that go into the battery system, and it is able to measure things like watts and amps coming out of the battery along with the voltage, etc., to give you a state of charge and time remaining to discharge. What had happened is that because it was mounted inside the engine bay here, the terminals and the data cable had started to corrode due to the exposure to the elements, and this had slowly got worse and worse, hence the problem occurring more frequently to the point where the system wasn't able to run on a full 12 volts when high-powered loads like the inverter were activated. So this was a 3-part fix. First of all, obviously we needed a new Victron shunt, so a new one was ordered and installed into the vehicle. The second part of the fix, well, it definitely wasn't going back down here again where it previously was. This time it was mounted inside the vehicle. Now, this is great because it protects it from the exposure of all the elements that we have out here and in the engine bay. However, it did mean it running some very heavy duty cable through the vehicle, down the driver's side sills and into the rear of the vehicle where it's attached to the side of the draw system. So A little bit more expensive and a bit more labor intensive. However, it's definitely going to be worth it to ensure that I have a good quality electrical system moving forward. So the third part of the fix was rewiring that 1000-watt inverter. The wiring just simply wasn't adequate from Ultimate 4-wheel drive equipment, and it was way too small. There was no way I was going to achieve that 1000-watt potential with that wiring and voltage drop. So we rewired straight from the batteries to the inverter with cabling 4 times that size. This means that I'm definitely going to get that 1000-watt potential, and I've also took the opportunity to again switch the circuit from the primary starting battery across to the lithium auxiliary, meaning that I can run this inverter while the engine is switched off and not be worried about starting the vehicle again. I have tested the inverter and I've managed to pull that full 1000 watt at almost 80 amps successfully from that lithium auxiliary with the vehicle switched off, which I'm pretty happy about and find quite impressive. The other electrical issue was obviously the Victron battery monitor itself. It suffered from the same symptoms as the Emu Wing box, switching on and off intermittently, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 5 days. Now, although it was more of a frustration at the time, little did I know that this little guy was the reason that the electrical system was failing overall. The most frustrating part with this Victron system was that when it turned off and on again, the state of charge would reset to 100%. So say you're using the vehicle and you've used it overnight to power some fridges and lights at camp, and you're say running at 78%. If this unit would switch off and on again, even for a split second, that state of charge would return to 100%. Now, given that I'm running lithium batteries and I can't visually observe the state of charge through voltage, I was relying on that to tell me how many amp hours or how much power I had left in those batteries, and therefore how much more I could power. With this thing flicking on and off consistently throughout the trip, I was always running at 100% according to that monitor. However, I knew that there was much less in that battery. Now, obviously, with that new Victron shunt installed and moved to a more protected zone within the draw system here, I've had no issues since. The state of charge has been great and I've had no power loss to that unit. So in that problems and issues video I released about 6 months ago, I also mentioned an issue with the keyless entry system on the Cruiser. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't, and sometimes it would take 10 to 30 seconds to lock or unlock the vehicle. Now, this is an issue that I'm still facing and haven't managed to find a solution for it just yet. I still believe that it's going to be some electrical interference from one of the aftermarket accessories or modifications that I've added to the Cruiser. But at the moment, it's something that I still have to get used to. I must say that it feels like it's happening less often, but maybe it's just me getting used to it. Either way, still a problem that I haven't solved yet. So just to top it off, we are still getting some electrical issues popping up on the Landcruiser. We've now got a negative standby draw on the batteries. Now, those who watched my last video would go, well, this is not a new problem, you mentioned it last time. However, the issue has swapped sides. It's gone from a negative standby draw from the auxiliary battery over there to the primary cranking battery over here. So I'm not sure what's happened, but we're now getting a 0.26 amp or around that mark negative standby draw on this cranking battery, which means that I only get about 5 to 6 days of inactivity with the Landcruiser before this is flat and I'm unable to start the battery. So in my opinion, that's much, much worse. So it's still something I have to have a look at, get fixed, get repaired, and come back to you guys with a solution. So before I wrap this video up, I want to say a huge thank you to Mark at Automotive Electrical Designs in O'Connor, WA. Mark, the director, spent a fair bit of time with me before the car was booked in to go over all of the electrical faults and exactly what I wanted to get out of the work he was going to do. I was booked in with about 4 to 5 weeks wait time, which is very good considering some of the quoted wait times I was getting from other companies. Further, the car was booked in for 2 days to get all of this work completed. However, ended up taking a third day given the nature of the work and how much had to be done. But during that time, Mark was very good at keeping me updated with my options, the pricing, and how long the vehicle was going to take to get done. So Mark also knew that I didn't live in Perth and I had to get back home as well. So on that third day, he stayed till after 10 PM to ensure the car was finished and in a state that could be driven out and used for regular camping trips. Obviously not all the work was completed as we still need to head back and get that negative standby draw sorted, but his obvious knowledge and professionalism was next level. I should say that I'm not sponsored or endorsed by the company whatsoever, and I paid regular retail price for his services just like anyone else, but someone I would highly recommend. There we have it. A lot of the electrical issues have been diagnosed and fixed. We've got a couple of new ones popping up there, but overall, I have a lot more confidence in this system that I'll be able to rely upon going into the future. On the other hand, I've been a little bit disappointed in some of the wiring and electrical work completed by Ultimate 4-wheel drive equipment, especially considering that I've rated them so highly in the past. Their wiring just simply wasn't up to scratch, and it feels like even though I had an electrical plan for the vehicle from new, Rather than customize and find a product that works, they've just tried to squeeze in a one-fit solution that just simply hasn't been up to the needs of the system that I want, and obviously the components for things like the Victron system. Either way, I've got a system that's in much better health now that I'm looking forward to moving on into the future, and hopefully we'll be able to diagnose and fix those last couple of niggly little issues. But for now guys, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. I've hoped I've managed to answer some of the questions that have been asked recently in regards to the issues that I've encountered. But for now, we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.